Okay, so first thing we see is that this is a maxillary central incisor. Then we need to go about identifying whether or not it is number 8 or 9. So first thing I do to identify that is they use the mesial and distal line angles. As you can tell, the mesial line angle is straighter versus the distal, which is more convex. Now in natural teeth, this is sometimes hard to distinguish, so I like to flip the tooth over and look at the lingual side. Again, you'll see that the marginal ridge on the mesial side is longer and straighter than the distal, which is shorter and curved. So that is identifying this as a number 9, so it would be our left central incisor. Another way that you can tell is that the root is straight. It's just another identifying mark. We'll go to an upper maxillary. Remember that this tooth has the second most variation in the mouth, so be aware of that, but also know that the incisal edge is always very curved. The mesial side is long and straight, and the distal is more rounded, and the lingual almost always has a lingual pit. A lot of confusion can be done on the canines. So here I have a maxillary canine and a mandibular canine. When looking at the two of them just straight down from the top, you can see. Kind of hard to see. The maxillary has that distal bulge. The mandibular does not. Okay, another way I like to tell is by the lingual inclination. That doesn't have that on the maxillary. Also, there's a facial ridge on the maxillary canine that is absent on the mandibular. So back to the maxillary canine, so that you can identify it from mesial, distal, or right or left sides. The mesial cusp ridge is very short in comparison to the distal cusp ridge, so we know that this is the mesial side of the tooth versus the distal side. Also, there is a dimensional or developmental depression on the distal root, and sometimes you'll see a distal root inclination. On same characteristics on the lower, you have the short cusp ridge length versus the long distal cusp ridge length. And then here you can see much more so that the crown is almost straight in the front, and then you have almost a C shape on the distal side of it. So that would tell us that this was the distal side of this tooth. So we know that this is tooth number 27, whereas this was tooth number 11. So here we have two mandibular teeth, and they are central incisors, and we need to tell the difference between the two of them. I know that this is my central incisor because my mesial side is practically straight and my distal side is also practically straight on my line angles, and my incisal edges are very square and boxy, and the root is practically straight. You know it's the distal because it has a distal depression. And this line angle is a little shorter than this mesial line angle. This tooth here is a lateral mandibular incisor. The distal incisal edge is rounded, whereas the mesial incisal edge is more square and straight. The distal root has a developmental depression, and the root has a distal inclination. Another area that I noticed that people struggled in was premolars. So we'll go ahead and start with maxillary premolars first. So just looking at these, you can tell that one is single rooted and one is double rooted. We know that the first maxillary premolar has 2 roots typically, but it could have a single root. If you have a single rooted maxillary premolar, the best way to determine that it's a second or a first is to look straight down at it from the occlusal surface. The shape of the first maxillary premolar is pentagonal, whereas the second maxillary premolar is more ovoid in shape. So here we have our pentagonal shape versus our ovoid shape. So let's go ahead and focus on this one for now, which this is our maxillary first premolar. We see the pentagonal shape. That pentagonal shape causes the crown to have a convexity on it, and that convexity yields a mesial marginal groove. That is a significant trait for only this premolar. So a mesial marginal groove is our first maxillary premolar, and so is this convexity along with the pentagonal shape. They also call it a hexagonal shape. Oh, another significant feature to know is that if you were to look at the cusp heights, the cusp height on the facial cusp is taller than the lingual cusp. This is our functional cusp, and this is our non-functional facial buccal cusp versus our functional lingual cusp. So that you see the significant height difference. If we go to our our maxillary second premolar, just for the comparison again, you see the difference in the shape of the crown. The second premolar has a single root. We know this is the distal side because of the distal inclination of the root. We look at the incisal surface in case that root dimension isn't there. You can see that it's much wider on the occlusal table going distally than it is mesially. Also, we know that this is a second maxillary premolar because the cusp heights are practically the same height. Moving to the lowers. I don't know if this shows up very well, but you can see how there's a lingual inclination on the facial side of the tooth, or buccal side of the tooth. Okay, our first mandibular premolar resembles a canine. You can see this really significantly because the height of the buccal cusp is very much higher than the lingual cusp. It's almost, I think they said it was a 45-degree angle, but you can see that steep angle there. So the lingual cusp is much shorter than the buccal cusp, and there are only 2 cusps on this tooth. Again, you can see that the marginal ridge is much narrower on the mesial than it is on the distal. And also a distal root depression and a distal inclination of the root. The second mandibular premolar has 3 cusps. So we have the 1, 2, and 3. Our third cusp is very small and always located on the distal, so that'll help you identify that this is the distal side of the tooth. If that cusp is hard to see, you might want to look at the distal inclination of the root, and again the distal developmental depression. Now we'll go on to molars. So we know that these guys here are definitely mandibular molars because they have 2 roots, so that's significant. And we'll talk about that third molar here in a minute. But our first mandibular molar we know has 5 cusps and 2 roots. And we know that that 5th cusp is on the distal side. So then that tells us that this is our lower left first premolar. Or sorry, first molar. This one here is our second molar on the lower lower left, and you can tell the distal side of it because the let me look at this right. Okay, so the distal side of it, the marginal ridge is wider and the lingual cusp are taller. So you know that this identifies it as the lingual side because the lingual cusp are taller. You can see that at that angle maybe. Okay. Our third molar on the lower, we have 4 cusps. Whereas our maxillary third molar only has 3 cusps. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 on the mandibular and 1, 2, 3 on the maxillary. Maxillary molars we know have three roots. We know that this is our maxillary first molar because of the cusp of carabelli and the oblique ridge. That's pretty simple. The functional cusps are the lingual cusp, so they're shorter than the non-functional buccal cusp, so that helps us determine lingual from that. And then the cusp of carabelli is always on the mesiolingual cusp. Our second maxillary molar, there is no cusp of carabelli, but we still have the oblique ridge, and our distal lingual cusp is much smaller. And that's it. Hope it helps.